Welcome to Lifespan Development, also known as Human Development. Chapter 1 here just provides an overview of various theorists that we will be discussing throughout class and just kind of an introduction to what the future chapters are going to be about. Each section or age group is broken into 3 parts. There's physical, cognitive, and then socio-emotional development. So as we progress through the class, we will start with pregnancy and birth, work our way through infancy, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, older adulthood, and then we'll talk about death and dying at the end of the book. Ted Kaczynski and Alice Walker come from 2 complete different backgrounds. Ted Kaczynski is known to have a very high IQ, considered gifted, comes from more of an advantaged background due to his high level of intelligence. He graduated high school early, went to college early, and worked as a professor at Stanford University. With his level of intelligence, he could have done anything he wanted to in this life. But with that high intelligence sometimes comes a lot of emotional struggles trying to relate to other peers your age. And so what we see with Ted Kaczynski is even though he had all the support and opportunity in the world, he still withdrew from society, lived as a hermit, and is known for being the Unabomber and sending out bombs through the mail. It was his brother actually that discovered he was the bomber and turned him into authorities. Alice Walker comes from a very disadvantaged background. She lost her eyesight in one eye at a young age due to a BB gun incident with her siblings. But even though she came from no money and had this disability in life and was African American, she still won the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple. So she, amounted and became something in her life, even though she started from, not much support. So it's not necessarily who you come from or what you're born into. We all have, decisions to make in life and take different paths. And sometimes, it's related to our experiences throughout life. As I stated on the first slide, the book is broken into 3 parts: biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional. So biological is just that. It's, our DNA. It's what we inherit from our parents. Cognitive, anything to do with the mind, how we think, what our thoughts are, how we process information, memory, all of that represents our cognitive processes. And then socio-emotional is our interactions that we have with other people. So it starts with our family early in life, and then gradually our peers, other influences like teachers growing up. So that is going to represent our human connection as we move throughout life. I don't want you to get too hung up on specific ages when it comes to the different stages in life. There are some theorists that represent adolescence as like 11 through 19. Others might say just your teenage years, 13 to 19. Recent studies suggest that we are adolescents, at least in our minds, in our brains, until we're 23. So this is approximately, your age when puberty starts until you kind of reach that next level of thinking. So late teens or maybe early 20s. So Shay here breaks it into 4 parts. The next 2 are on the following slide. So adolescence and young adulthood. Adolescence is all about acquisition. We want to acquire as much information as we possibly can, and that helps us to decide who we want to be later on in life. Young adulthood is about achievement. So we take that knowledge and then we go out in the world and apply those skills in whatever career path or, relationships that we've built, marriages, families, we go out and apply that. Young adulthood would be 20 to 40, 20 to 35. Again, it really depends on what theorist you're looking at, but young adulthood is typically represents your 20s and your 30s. And then his next two are middle adulthood here and late adulthood. Middle adulthood, a lot of responsibility. Many people are raising their families, their children. Hopefully in the midst of your career and whatever career goals you set out to have, you are now achieving and successful in those careers. Generally, middle adulthood is 40s and 50s. Late adulthood, for this would be starting around the age of 60 and going through the end of life. There are some theories that have started to look at like older adults and then older or older oldest adults, because 60 to the end of life, I mean, for some could be 40 plus years. So it's very different what you're doing at age 60 or 70 versus what somebody's doing at maybe 85 or 90. But for Shay, he just lumps it all late adulthood. So that's the reintegration. So back into your life and yourself and what you want to do with the rest of your life. People start to think about retirement. Generally speaking, most of their children have been grown and out of the house. And so it's just themselves, or, if they're with a partner, they're kind of reintegrating back into finding out who they are and what their purpose is now that they've reached this stage of life. So Paul Baltz looks at the biological and sociocultural and how us as individuals work together to make our choices and find our paths in life. His views, multidimensional, multidirectional, plastic, multidisciplinary, and contextual. We'll review those on the next slide. There's definitions for each of them. So I'm going to let you guys read through these slides, and these are, like I said, just the definitions of how Baltz looks at each one. Obviously these kind of change and shape our lives as we move throughout the lifespan. I want you to think about the plastic too. We often talk about plasticity when it comes to the brain. That's the ability of the brain to kind of sometimes make new connections, use other parts of the brain when damage happens that we typically wouldn't use. So we in general are very plastic, and we are able to adapt to various situations, and our experiences and our thoughts, help us do that. But we're plastic throughout life. We often get set in our ways, and it gets harder to change as we get older, but we definitely have the ability to shape and reshape who we are as we move through life. So when we looked at Shay started with adolescence. Paul Baltz here looks at the breakdown of the lifespan a little bit differently and lumps childhood and adolescence together as the first age. Second age being prime adulthood through our 50s. So this would represent younger adulthood as well as middle adulthood. Third age being 60 to about 79 or 80 years of age. So this, like I said, gets into kind of the retirement era. And approximately 80 years and older would be his fourth age. So he does break it the older part of life down, but it's so hard. As you'll see when we talk about Erickson has 8 stages of development, and some even suggest we could really use a 9th one to break up the older adulthood. But to lump childhood and adolescence together, and to lump second and third age together and fourth age, it's just there's so much developmentally that goes on at the different stages in life. It's really hard to look at childhood and adolescence and be like, this is what kids are doing at this age or at this stage. It's so general, but you'll see some of the other theorists as they break it down different. These are just some questions I want you to think about, some things that come up as we talk about families and lifespan and education and just a variety of things. But there's a lot of studies going on right now in terms of gay and lesbian families and relationships and what the outcome of the children will be. There's nothing to suggest that, if kids are raised in a household where they have 2 moms or 2 dads, that they're going to turn out any different. But because it's still kind of new and hasn't been happening for that long, there's a lot of research that's being poured into the alternative families that we see today. children being harmed if both parents work outside the home. It's for a lot of families, it's a must. You can't live off of one income today. We saw a shift in the 90s where we saw both parents go to work. Part of that is the late 80s, we saw a spike in divorces. And so we saw more single parent families. There has been some increase in prices of homes, rent, products. That's increased our lifestyles and what we want. I mean, think about, does everybody in your family have an iPhone or, like the latest Android? Those are $1,000 phones. Our lifestyles, we're not living as simple and as, low cost as we used to. So the way we're just choosing to live is, increase the income that we need as well to survive. Are U.S. schools failing to adequately teach our children how to read, write, and calculate? The education system here needs some work. If you look, there's a documentary. It was on TV not too long ago. It's called Waiting for Superman. It came out in, I want to say maybe 2009 is when it was released. And this lady was going to revamp the whole school system, not just district by district, but across the United States. And basically everything that she came to do failed, and we are no better off now than we were then. I believe we rank 21 and 25 when it comes to like math and science in your developed nations. We could do better. We could definitely do better. We have kids that can't read at grade level. We have many people starting college that are not reading at college level. One of the things that I did early in my career is taught developmental reading for college students, and a lot of them are reading at maybe like a 6th, 7th, 8th grade level when they started college. So we could do better than what we're doing. One of the books that was the required reading for the class was called The Giver by Lois Lowry, and many of you probably read that book around middle school age, and that was the level that they were at starting college. So everybody's obviously going to start at their own level and work at their own pace, which is fine. But our elementary, middle, and high schools could do better so that students are starting a little bit higher and reading a little bit more effectively and efficiently. Some of your book will look at different cultures, so not just like the Western or Caucasian population, but you'll see some of the minority population in here as well. Cross-cultural studies, when those are examined, we look at least 2 different cultures and kind of do like a compare and contrast. Generally, those are examined over a long period of time, so they might study a group or a couple groups of people for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years or more. So that research tends to go on for longer periods of time. When you hear the word ethnicity or ethnic, we look at cultural heritage, race, nationality, religion, language. All of this helps to shape our cognitive processes as well as our socio-emotional ones. And this is what helps us to build on our experiences and relate to the world around us and decide which path we're going to take in life. Each of these items that are listed here all play a significant role in the person that we become. We'll look at gender a little bit as we move, probably around adolescence in terms of boys and girls and transgender population and things like that. There's a lot of research that's going on right now, and it's kind of a hot topic in psychology and trying to determine what is best for children that identify as the opposite sex in which they were born. So we'll talk a little bit about some of this as we move later on in the class. These are various social policies. Often these are hot topics when it comes to politics, and we are in an election year this year, so I'm sure some of this will be talked about. The poverty line, really in regard to the income levels. So a family of 4, they can't make more than around $2,700. I might be off a little bit there. It's difficult for a family of four to live off of that little income, and if you're a family that makes $2,200 a month, the help that you might get from the government would be very minimum. But, if you're a family of four and you're bringing in $1,500 a month, then that's going to increase your income. But there's not a lot of incentive sometimes for families to get off of it, because if you fall just over, the cutoff, then all of your help gets pulled, and, it's still not enough money. People have denied themselves raises at work, because if they get that 50 cents a raise per hour, that's going to put them over the poverty line and they're going to lose all their help. Well, is 50 cents more an hour really going to be sufficient to help them make sure that they meet their expenses every month? The healthcare system, we know, has been a hot topic. We have the Obamacare that was rolled out, but that has not been as effective as it was thought it would be. Social Security for seniors and the amount that they get. So all these are hot topics right now, and social policies, and obviously differ from city to city, state to state, and at the federal level as well. You'll see with some of these theorists, kids don't just learn from teachers. So when we say teachers, especially in regards to Vygotsky's theory, which you'll learn about, it's not just a formal teacher up there teaching a class, instructing, but kids learn from each other. And so interactions like what you see here in the picture, there's a lot that she could learn from him, as well as the reverse too. She could even teach him some things, and so we look at interactions like this and try and utilize situations to help the children grow and learn in their development, and just work together. So, these types of interactions improve the socio-emotional processes and help kids learn to relate to people that are outside of their, inner family circles and peers. So on the next slide, periods of development, you'll see again how the age range is kind of broken down differently. So this is pretty much, like I said, how your book is going to break it down. You can see the biological, cognitive, socio-emotional processes are here. This is, again, approximation and really depends on which theorist you're talking about. Adolescence is the one that's, probably got the biggest gap in terms of when does it really start, when does it really end. Like I said, there's research now that suggests 23 would be the end of adolescence, but we know our brain does not fully mature until age 25. So some argue, maybe adolescence should go till 25. Maybe we should raise adulthood to 21. So there's a lot of ideas and talk out there, but this is just kind of gives you an approximation of what we're looking at for different periods of development throughout the book. Age is not just a number. There are several ways to look at age. Chronological age would be, if you're 21, that's your chronological age at 21. If you're 40, that's your chronological age at 40. Biological age is in terms of health. So you might have somebody that's 40 years old but has a lot of health complications. Maybe they've had a heart attack or a stroke, so their biological age might be like 57. Psychological age is their mentality, how they think like other people their age. We know that women tend to mature faster than men, but, do you have a 25-year-old who is already established in their career and, settled on their partner, and, maybe they have a psychological age of a 30-year-old versus, another 25-year-old might, not know what they want to do in life yet and have a psychological age of a 21-year-old because they're, still trying to find themselves. Social age refers to maturity, so similar to psychological age, but, there are some people that just never grow up, and, you have some people that are 35, 40, 45, 50 years old and still act like they're in high school or college. There is some research that shows that happiness increases with age. Oftentimes it's because the problems that you have when you're in your 20s trying to find yourself, in your 30s trying to establish yourself, and in your 40s trying to maintain everything. Once the kids are out of the house, there is some truth in that happiness increasing because it takes away the stressors and you have more time for yourself. And so there is a point where we do see happiness kind of increases with the aging process. So Freud is one that you're probably familiar with. So he's got so many parts to his theory, but this is his psychosexual stages of development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. So these ages are about accurate. What you're going to see with Freud. Babies take in everything, through their mouth. They put everything in the mouth. That's how they figure out the world around them. So we call that the oral stage. The anal stage is all about potty training. The phallic stage, this is where if you've heard of the Oedipus and the Electra complex before, the phallic stage would be this. The Oedipus complex is, a boy, quote unquote, falls in love with his mother and wants the father out of the picture, and mom has to do everything. And it's the opposite, with the Electra complex for girls wanting all the attention from the dad and wanting mom out of the picture. And they don't always understand that parents have love for multiple people because they don't have this reversibility concept that Piaget talks about. And so it doesn't happen with every child, but there is sometimes, where around preschool age, kids get attached to the opposite sex parent and want that parent to do everything for them. Latency stage is the only stage that Freud says nothing sexual is going on. Other than that, he thinks that sex drives everything in life. And the genital stage would be the start of puberty, 11, 12-ish years of age, and it's called the sexual reawakening. And so that's where you start to, develop an interest in whoever you're going to date in life. This is Erickson, and Erickson has the 8 stages, like I mentioned earlier. So this starts at the bottom with trust versus mistrust and works its way up to the top. He's got it good here with the different stages and breaking it down. There are some changes that could be made, but for the most part, he does well, examining each stage, one at a time. Theorists like stages. So most of your theorists have said, at this age or this stage of life, this is what should be happening. And Erickson has the verses. So trust versus mistrust. If you don't establish trust, then you have the opposite to that, which is mistrust. And so kids or babies where their basic needs are not met and they're neglected or they're abused at a young age develop a sense of mistrust, and that will show in other relationships as they, move throughout life. Even Freud has some opposites. And so people that have like an oral fixation, smoking, biting on their nails, chewing on pens or pencils, that would be an oral fixation. Freud would say that something wasn't satisfied during that oral stage of development, and now they're fixated on it later on in life. Erickson's trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, all of them kind of work the same way. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, then you're stuck and you have trouble moving forward into the other stages until you've met that. The only one that I would argue here that we've talked about is the integrity versus despair, late adulthood, 60s onward. Like I said earlier, it's very different what you're doing in your 60s and early 70s compared to what somebody's doing at 85 or 90. So we have to maybe break that age period down a little bit. But when all of these theorists lived and worked, life expectancy wasn't what we know it as today. If you were born in 1900, you were expected to live 55 years on average. So we know people outlived that number, but that was the expectation at that time. Right now, our life expectancy is around 80 years of age, women slightly higher, men slightly lower. But based on when these theorists were working, to get to the 60s, that was, pretty much the end of your life at that time. There's this end-old debate on nature and nurture, and you'll never get both sides to agree. Some say nature, the biological, the DNA, the genetic is more prominent and more important to development than the nurture side, which is your environmental and experiences in life. But it's really not, just strictly one or the other. Obviously, your DNA, your biological side is going to play a role in who you are to some extent, but as is your experiences in life and the environment in which you're raised. So there's, pieces of both that are going to fit into who we are and who we become in life. So we often explore these in twin studies because we have the same biological makeup with twins. But if they, have different personalities, that could be based on their experiences that they had and why their personalities differ from one another. So they can be interesting subjects to study. I'm not sure if these gentlemen are in the book, but there's a well-known twin set that was studied, Jim and Jim. And Jim and Jim are popular because they were obviously born with the same DNA, but they were raised in two separate households. They were given up for adoption and they were given up to adoption separately, so they were not raised together. Even though they were not raised together, very similar as adults is what we found, a lot of similarities. Both men, I believe, worked as volunteer firefighters. They both married a woman with the same name. They both named their dog the same thing. I think they both smoked cigarettes. I think the only difference between them is like one parted his hair to the left and the other parted his hair to the right. But they were raised in two separate households, but there was just so much identical in their lives. So that was an interesting case to study. Although you could make the argument, though, that they were both raised in like a suburban middle-class environment, and that's what helped shape them as well. So if you've seen, most of the theorists that we've mentioned so far have this discontinuity. So looking at distinct stages and, this happens at this age and this stage versus a cumulative change, which is continuity. So most of our theorists will follow the discontinuity. Qualitative changes is when a child goes from no abstract thinking to being able to think abstractedly. So that's just one example of what a qualitative change would look like. Abstract thinking, we look at a little bit with Piaget, which is a little bit in elementary school, 3rd, 4th grade. We start to think a little bit abstractedly, and then we see an increase of that when we hit high school and adolescence. You've heard me mention Piaget already. So Piaget has 4 stages of development, like Freud has 5 and Erickson has 8. Erickson is our guy that takes us all the way birth through death. Freud is a child development theorist. Piaget is a child development theorist, but again has the stages. So sensory motor would be like birth to 2 years. Pre-operational would be 6 to 7. Concrete would be your elementary school years, so 7 to like 11 or 12. And then formal operation would be 11 or 12 into adolescence or into adulthood. So we'll examine these stages as we go throughout the book as well. Piaget did start a post-formal thought, which he worked on with adults a little bit, but it really never latched on to his core 4 stages that he developed in his career. Piaget and Vygotsky are often talked about together, but have 2 different views. So Piaget follows a cognitive perspective in psychology. Vygotsky follows a sociocultural perspective in psychology. But the reason why they're talked about together is both were born in 1896, but Vygotsky died in 1934. He had some illness and passed away, so he was only 37 when he died. Piaget died in 1980, so he was 84 when he died. So Piaget essentially had a whole other lifetime on top of Vygotsky to grow his theory. Vygotsky gets criticized because he doesn't have the stages that Piaget has or Freud has or Erickson has. Had he lived longer, he probably would have developed the stages. But nevertheless, because he has this sociocultural approach, he's very well known in the schools. and with his theory. So we'll get into a little bit of that as we move through. I think we'll talk more about him in the late elementary school years, middle childhood years is where we'll see him. But he's very prominent in the education system with his theory. Skinner, I hope you remember from Introduction to Psychology and his operant conditioning theory. So he was all about the rewards and punishments and reinforcers, positive, negative reinforcement, positive, negative punishment. He was all about shaping behavior using these rewards and punishments. And so when we punish, we want behavior to stop. And when we reward or reinforce, we want behavior to continue. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. It's just, reinforcement or reward, behavior continues, punishment, behavior stops. So, think about this as positive and negative as being adding and subtracting rather than, positive is good and negative is bad. If you think of it like that, it gets confusing and it won't make sense. So we're either adding or taking away to reinforce or punish behavior. Bandura has that Bobo doll experiment. Big blow-up doll is weighted at the bottom with like sand or water, and when you punch it, it pops back up. So he does our social cognitive theory, or observational learning is another way that he looks at it. And so with that experiment, he had kids watch an adult beat up on this doll and then let the kids go in and play. And then he had another group who didn't watch the adult beat up on the doll and the kids just got to go in and play. And so they were looking at levels of aggression. And what we found is that the kids that watched the adult beat up on the doll showed more aggression, and not just in their physical aggression, but also their verbal language aggression than the control group who didn't see the adult. But it's not enough to say, watching violence causes it. There's a correlation there, but there's not enough to say that the kids are acting violent because they saw the violence. Konrad Lorenz, imprinting is his main idea. He did the migrating goose, and so he modeled or imitated the behaviors of a goose to raise the goslings. And so obviously he's not a goose, and there's no hereditary there, but he was still able to teach them how to swim and how to find food and how to survive in their environment despite not being of the same species. So he was able to imprint those behaviors on him. John Bowlby worked with Mary Ainsworth. Both of them did attachment theory. And so there's critical periods in life. And so all these theorists say that, you have to meet this critical period by this age, otherwise you suffer and you struggle later on down the line. Just like Erickson's trust versus mistrust. If you don't build trust that first year, then you develop a sense of mistrust. And so we look at attachment theory and hope to develop secure attachment as we move throughout development. So we'll look at those different types of attachment as well. So this is Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory of development. So you can kind of see in this diagram the interactions. This starts with the microsystem at the center, and then the mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, and the chronosystem on the outside. So this is you in the middle and how you interact with all these different things: school, peers, religious groups, churches, parks in the neighborhood, just your community overall. And you can see the mesosystem kind of links you to these larger exosystem, and it just kind of works its way out. So we'll look at some examples of this on the next slide. So the setting in which the individual lives for the microsystem, this is your neighborhood, your immediate surroundings. The mesosystem is how you go out to the store and do your grocery shopping, and you go to the gas station, you go to the bank, and you have all these interactions, the school system within your area, within your community. Our exosystem links these social settings to the next level. And so, the ads that you see on TV that are played specifically to your community or your area increases your likelihood to go out and visit those businesses. The macro system looks at our culture in which we live, and the chronosystem tracks this over time. Oftentimes, we think of something like Hurricane Katrina. Well, we don't think about that anymore because we weren't necessarily affected. We weren't living down in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. It didn't affect all of us the same way as it did those that lived there. And so it's been so many years, we put it out of our mind. But those people were forever impacted because they got spread out to other cities. And so now their microsystem is gone, right? And so we've, taken that person, dropped them into a new city, and so now that microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem has changed because you have this new person that's there. And so that's going to change their interactions, and maybe that person moved and now they're living in, Dallas. A lot of them went to Texas, and now they open up a business. And so that's changed that whole system and how, that system is run because this influence of these other people that have moved in. So the chronosystem looks at things over long periods of time, not just, days, weeks, and months, but years and decades, and, to try and identify patterns of environmental effects and how things have changed over time. So that's just kind of an introduction to some of the theories that we'll talk about. There's other ones that'll come up in there, but these are a lot of the main important ones that we'll discuss as we go throughout the book. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what is to come and an idea of what some of the more prominent theorists are in the textbook.